It would be a case that reshaped the diving industry across the globe. An American couple diving in the Great Barrier Reef in beautiful Queensland, Australia, were left behind in open waters by the diving company responsible for keeping them safe. None of their fellow divers, the captain, or the crew noticed them not in the boat at the scheduled return time and made the hour-and-a-half journey back to shore, leaving the Lonergans in the shark-infested waters. They wouldn't be discovered missing for over 48 hours, and when the search began, there'd been no trace of the couple. Since their disappearance, there have been rumors of a suicide pact, murder, or that there had been a larger plan to stage their deaths and start new lives. But no one can really know without a doubt what happened to Eileen and Tom Lonergan. Let's get into it. It had been a perfect day for diving on January 25, 1998. Married couple 33-year-old Tom Lonergan and his 28-year-old wife Eileen Lonergan were on a weekend getaway after wrapping up a 2-year contract with the Peace Corps teaching in Fiji. The water was said to have been as clear as glass, no wind, and near perfect visibility. That morning, they left their hostel in Cairns, Australia, and took a pre-booked 40-minute bus ride to Port Douglas. They had booked the round-trip shuttle ahead of time, and they were set to return when the dive tour completed around 4:30 p.m. The Australian trip was going to cap off their time in the South Pacific. They were headed back to a new chapter of their lives, going back to a quote-unquote normal life back in Baton Rouge, Louisiana for the first time in years. They seemed to both struggle with what their lives were going to be moving forward. Tom had enrolled in college but didn't have a lot of direction. We know this because they both kept extremely detailed and poetic diaries. The way they wrote was lyrical, expressive, and dramatic. They wrote in hand-bound leather books, and they wrote in a way that left all of their emotions, thoughts, and fears on the page, and they wrote a lot, near daily, with pages and pages of entries. In Fiji, they had lived in a remote village. For years, they lived without electricity and running water. They taught together, but Eileen struggled with the students. Tom was better at it, but neither shared a passion for teaching, but they did care about their students. They both shared a deep love for the ocean. They were very experienced and competent divers, and their love of the sea was something that really bonded the pair together. Diving had been something Eileen had been passionate about before she'd met Tom, and was something that she'd passed on to him. While diving in Fiji, Eileen wrote to her mother about an extremely emotional experience that they'd had in the water. They'd been approached by a whale, so close they'd been able to reach out and touch it. Eileen looked into the whale's eyes and felt a deep connection to the animal. It had been a spiritual experience for both Tom and Eileen, and it left them buzzing. Tom wrote after the experience, quote, "Like a student who has finished an exam, I feel that my life is complete and I'm ready to die. As far as I can tell from here, my life can only get worse. It's peaked. It's all downhill from here until my funeral." They arrived at the harbor at 8:30 a.m. and boarded the tour boat operated by the Outer Edge. They were joined by 26 other guests. Not everyone was diving, most were snorkeling, but all had been promised a spectacular day on the water. It was absolutely ideal conditions, and the group was incredibly excited to get going. The crew loaded the gear on the boat and put air tanks and other diving gear, accounting for everyone diving that day. Outer Edge had planned on taking the group to 3 different sites, staying at each area for about an hour and a half before heading back to port. It was an all-day package, and there wasn't a second tour booked that day for the boat or the crew. The Lonergans had a lot of their own diving gear, and despite the heat of the day, they opted to dive in full protective gear. and their experience allowed them to maximize their air tanks, allowing them to be in the water just a little bit longer. For the first 2 dives, they'd been the last 2 people back on the boat, capitalizing on every second they could be in the water. Their last dive for the day was an area of the reef called Fish City. It had spectacular displays of thousands of fish, and it was going to be the highlight of the tour. There are some reports that the boat that day was running late. It was about 3:30 p.m. when Outer Edge started up the engine to depart the area. So every time a passenger went into the water, they were supposed to log out and then log back in when they were back on the vessel. And another measure of security is conducting a head count. The boat sat for about 15 minutes while the crew checked everyone back onto the boat, put away all the equipment, and passed out cold refreshments to the passengers, and counted everyone up before heading back to Port Douglas. Not one of the crew members had noticed that 2 of their guests for the day hadn't checked back in, and their head count was too short. Once back at the port, the guests departed, taking all of their belongings with them. And again, no concerns were raised when 2 pairs of shoes and 2 backpacks were left on the boat. The bus driver also waited nearby. The bus company knew that the Lonergans had gone out with Outer Edge, so after waiting for about an hour, the driver went up to the crew and asked if they knew where the Lonergans were, as they'd booked a shuttle back to Cairns and he needed to get going. The captain, Jack Nairn, reassured the driver that the Lonergans must have taken another method back to their hostel and to just head out. The driver felt that had been very strange and called his supervisor, who also spoke to Outer Edge, but both times they were reassured that maybe the Lonergans had made friends with other guests and had gone out with them, just tourists doing tourist things. The bus driver eventually left, and the crew brought the Lonergans' belongings back to their office, and then everyone went home. Well, everyone except Tom and Eileen. The next morning, Outer Edge returned to the same area that they'd been the previous day. And a crew member with the company was out at Fish City with clients and discovered 6 loose diving weights on the seabed with the Outer Edge label on them. However, again, this wasn't marked as odd. There were lots of different diving companies, and some people were careless with the equipment, so it was normal for crew members to tidy up after clients. It wouldn't be until Tuesday evening, 2 full days since the Lonergans had been left at sea, when employees at the Outer Edge office decided to open up the bags left behind from the Sunday excursion. Inside, they found the Lonergans' wallets, travel documents, and cash. Things they'd been unlikely to forget for 2 days traveling. Panic and realization began to set in for the employees at Outer Edge. Phone records showed staff members making frantic calls, trying to find a better outcome than what they assumed might have happened. When they called the Lonergans' hostel, the Walkabout, and spoke to the owner, Barry Waymans, Barry confirmed that they hadn't seen the Lonergans since they took a shuttle out to Port Douglas. The hostel owner had been the one who was furious, and it was he who called the police to report the couple missing. Police were called 52 hours after the Outer Edge had left Fish City and left Tom and Eileen in the water. By the time the police had been called, search conditions were not good. It was too dark and the search couldn't be started until dawn. In addition to law enforcement and local searchers, the Australian Navy had been called in to aid the search. 20 aircrafts were also deployed to search 8,600 nautical square miles. In total, there were waterplanes, helicopters, boats, divers, and people on foot searching the coastlines near the reefs. All were looking for any sign of the missing American couple. Once a search was underway, there had been maintained hope that Eileen and Tom could have survived for up to 4 days in the water. They had already lost nearly 3 days in the delay, but there was still hope. Unlike many of their companions, Tom and Eileen had gone out that day in full gear, despite the warm weather. They had on heavy, long-sleeve wetsuits, hoods, and gloves, which would have been critical and had the potential to really increase their chances of staving off hypothermia. However, dehydration was still a concern, and a deadly predator known to stalk that area: tiger sharks. After 4 days of searching and finding no sign of Tom and Eileen, the search was eventually called off. Law enforcement found several things strange. The first was with Outer Edge. How had they left 2 of their passengers out in the water that day? The company was thoroughly investigated by law enforcement. The captain took full responsibility for the mistake, but it had been the whole crew ultimately responsible. The captain stated that the logbooks not being filled out was a negligent mistake and a bad habit picked up over time, where the crew would fill the logbooks out while they were heading back, but for some reason it had just been missed entirely that day. He said that a head count had been conducted while people were still coming onto the deck from the water, and initially the count had come up short, but a recount had accidentally accounted for a couple who had been in the water at the start of the count, and then they were counted again when they came up onto the boat. Other guests who were also diving reported seeing the couple about 15 minutes before they were all supposed to wrap up their dives for the day, so they couldn't have been that far from the boat. Sound carries underwater quite a distance, and the boat had been idling for some time while the crew got everything in order to leave and also handing out drinks to guests. No one can understand how Tom and Eileen had missed the boat, even if they were a bit far away initially. Next were the circumstances of Tom and Eileen's disappearance. What also stood out as odd with law enforcement was when they discovered that there had been other vessels anchored at St. Crispin's Reef, the area where Outer Edge had anchored at. Many of the other boats were there long after Outer Edge had left, and no one reported seeing or hearing anyone in distress. One fishing boat had stayed in the area as late as midnight and had remained lit. The waters had been calm, and the boat would have been easy to spot. They also heard nothing, and in those conditions, they should have been able to hear someone calling for help in the water, even from quite a distance. Without any sign of the couple, this was when the theories started rolling in about what kind of people the Lonergans were. Their diaries were located amongst their belongings left behind at the hostel, and detectives started to pick apart their lives. The couple had met while attending the University of Louisiana. They got married in Jefferson, Texas, on June 24, 1988. The two had always had a very intense and passionate relationship. They were both extremely intelligent people. Tom describes himself as having few great loves in his life, and they were his intellect, his wife, his students, and diving. Tom was known to be kind of harsh and intense, and Eileen was the complete opposite of him and softened him. She was also the adventurous one of the two, and it had been her idea to join the Peace Corps. In Tom's diary, he writes that Eileen had been a gift from God and wrote of his utter devotion to his wife. Eileen wrote of her concerns for their marriage, and not that she didn't love Tom, but that she felt that she was losing her individuality. In their time on the remote islands in isolation, they had become one, but over time, the relationship had become too codependent for Eileen's taste. They both wrote about concerns they had for the future. Tom's diary starts to get a bit macabre. He wrote about life and God and their meanings. They each wrote of these kind of large philosophical discussions that they'd been having. Eileen wrote, quote, "Tom hopes to die a quick and painless death. and he hopes it happens soon. Tom's not suicidal, but he's got a death wish, and that could lead him to what he desires, and I could get caught in that. It had been that passage that led to several speculations that their disappearance hadn't just been a simple accident. Accusations that Tom had wanted to die and had perhaps wanted the two of them to die together, and had purposely missed the boat. However, it's important to note that they were really reading between the lines with that conclusion. Their writing style was consistently very dramatic and lyrical. There were also permanent pontoon structures built all around St. Crispin's Reef. The closest one had only been 6 kilometers from where Outer Edge had anchored. The structures are used as docking structures for various tours. It helps to not damage the reefs by using anchors near the delicate ecosystems. Experts speculated that they could have swum to them and hid there overnight and then got onto another boat when tours started coming back in. There had been reports that at the Agincourt pontoon, or Quicksilver pontoon, there had been a large vessel filled with Italian tourists. The head count before departure had been over by 3 guests, but it was chalked up to a miscount. However, Tom and Eileen's disappearance drew media attention. The vessel came forward with the report in case it turned out to be relevant. There were sightings of the couple all over Australia, which again drew law enforcement's attention to theories that the couple had staged their deaths to start a new life. What hadn't helped was that Tom and Eileen had been adamant that they didn't want to dive with others or with a dive master, and they wanted to go off on their own that day, which at the time hadn't drawn any concerns given that they were very experienced divers, but after the disappearance had led to more questions on why they wanted to be by themselves. 3 months went by, and Eileen's family went to Australia to see where Eileen and Tom had disappeared. They even dived the waters in the area with the help of Australian authorities escorting them. They eventually held a funeral for the couple, and after seeing the area for themselves, came to terms with the fact that the couple were no longer with them. 6 months after their disappearance, a team still looking for any signs of the Lonergans was combing a remote beach in Port Douglas when they saw something sticking out of the sand. The first item found was a woman's wetsuit. It was the same style that Eileen had been wearing the day that they had been last seen. It was the same size. It had a little damage on the bottom and the armpit area, but it had likely come from rubbing against coral in the currents before washing ashore. Otherwise, the suit was in pretty pristine condition. Once one item was found, a larger team was deployed to the area, and soon other items tied to the Lonergans were discovered. Over 100 kilometers or 75 miles from Fish City, they found 2 inflatable dive jackets, and these had Tom and Eileen's names written on the inside. So there was no speculation of who they belonged to. The next items found were dive tanks and 1 fin. Like the wetsuit, none of the items appeared to be damaged. They had searched for any sign of a shark attack, but other than some sun damage and barnacle growth, the items were in incredible condition. The clasps on the dive jackets also seemed to have been manually released rather than slipped off. It appeared that they had removed the gear themselves. They searched the area, hoping to recover bodies, but they weren't found. Then a diver's slate was found by fishermen 90 miles from where Eileen and Tom had been diving, around 6 months after their disappearance. The slate had been badly exposed to the elements, but once the fishermen made it out, they knew exactly who the slate had belonged to. It said, Monday, January 26, 1988, 8 a.m. To anyone who can help us, we have been abandoned here on Agincourt Reef by the MV Outer Edge. January 25th, 1998, 3 p.m. Please help us, or we will die. Help. Tom and Eileen Lonergan, 1502 Lenmore. The slate went through an extensive authentication verification. Based on the algae growth and the handwriting, experts believe that the slate was Tom Lonergan's, and he did write that note. According to the slate, that it appeared that the Lonergans had made it at least until the following morning, only missing the next round of tourist boats by hours. But the slate still didn't explain why other vessels nearby hadn't seen or heard any sign of them that first night. Despite finding all of these belongings of Eileen and Tom, it still ultimately only caused more questions than answers. Had delirium caused them to take off their equipment? Without the buoyancy vests, it would have made it impossible for them to tread water that long. And why did Eileen take off her wetsuit? Outer Edge and the owner Jack Nairn were charged with unlawful killing. At trial, Nairn was found not guilty, but Outer Edge was fined severely after pleading guilty. The company soon went out of business, and one report has said that none of the crew connected to the Lonergan trip worked in the diving industry anymore. Nairn deeply apologized to Eileen's family, and they gave him a hug after the trial and said that they forgave him. 9 months after their disappearance, Tom and Eileen were declared deceased by the Australian coroner's inquest. Their cause of death was listed as drowning or shark attack. One tiger shark expert from Port Douglas stated, quote, "My personal feeling is that they were taken by a tiger shark in the first 24 to 48 hours. Dead or alive, you wouldn't last too long out there." Because of the case, Australia implemented new regulations for the diving industry, including mandatory head counts conducted by captains and dive masters, more thorough regulations regarding the logbooks, more training for staff, and mandatory lookouts on board every tour boat, as well as harsher regulations and fines for negligence and non-compliance. Though there's no evidence that directly points to Eileen and Tom having made it out of the water, it wouldn't have been an impossible feat. Another former Baton Rouge resident, Milton Windsor Harris, had been on the run for 16 years, escaping prison for corporate embezzlement, and faked his death by jumping off of a ferry in New Zealand. He was discovered on the other side of the planet in Northern Ireland with his wife and 3 children. We may never know what happened to Eileen and Tom Lonergan, and without the discovery of their bodies, there will be no certainty in their disappearance, ultimately chalked up to an avoidable tragedy. So what do you think about Tom and Eileen's disappearance? Do you think that they succumbed to the elements, or do you think there's a possibility that they might still be out there? Let me know in that comment section below. And if there's anything you want me to cover next, I'm always open to suggestions. But for now, that's it for me. I'll see you on the next video. Stay safe out there, and good night.